Hello. Get your names down. Hi. Let's see here. So today we're going to do we're going to go over the Northern Colonies assignment. All right. Are there any questions or any comments? Feel free to unmute yourself.
I have a question. I'm having like a hard time putting together a paragraph. Whoa, a little close. Hi, good morning. I'm
Hi.
not sure if, or afternoon, if I just need to go to the library because, yeah, like I read the information and then I don't know what to say about it. Or like, I don't know how to find the thesis. And so then like, whenever I'm like, oh, I'm just gonna pick something because I'm always doing my own thing.
Okay.
And then it's like, I'll just pick a sentence that sounds cool. And then I could pick any of your information to back up whatever I want. So I don't know if you want me to do something like that, but I don't know how to pick out a thesis.
I'll tell you what, let's go ahead. Let's share the screen, okay? Pardon me here.
I know.
And let's take a look at this together, okay?
Okay.
And see what we can do. Are you guys are you still? Let's see here. Where are we? Where's my screen? Okay, let me try that again. It should share the screen. There we go. All right. So take a look at what we're doing here. We're doing the Northern Colonies, okay, above the Mason-Dixon line of Maryland. And so we're looking at first at the New England colonies. They're going to form a confederation 2 or 3 different times, just around the time of the War for Independence. And so oftentimes they're kind of linked together as such. But we're looking at New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth. All right, Maine won't be much of a colony yet. But looking at this, right, let's take a look. So for one, okay, Melissa, is I try to give a hint with the title. So number 1 says Puritan New England was progressive. All right, and by progressive, I mean basically, right, that they were at the cutting edge of that which is considered avant-garde or ahead of of culture, of institutions, whatever is forward-looking, right? Embracing modernity in the future. So let's see here. The Pilgrims and their Puritan contemporaries introduced various institutions and cultural habits far ahead of their time. So I try to lead in with my intro and be very distinct in what I'm trying to convey, all right? Regarding their civic and religious institutions, such were introduced under premises of the Protestant Reformation. That's just giving you context. So look, as opposed to the Catholic and Anglican churches, and then it goes on and says, right, that they wanted the lay people to interpret the Bible for themselves, to teach it to others, right? And they were not for a hierarchical organization of priests and bishops and archbishops and cardinals and a pope, right? Like the Anglican and the, well, without the pope in England, obviously, the Catholic Church. And so note, I'm doing a contrast here, right? And showing how they felt like they were avant-garde. They were at the head and the forefront of cultural change. And of course, change, right, is a relative term as far as the value of it. But in this case, they're definitely putting, and the writer is putting a positive spin on change, on that which is new, right, and contending, arguably, that is a good thing. Okay, and also in light of kind of a linear thought of where we are today, and how this was more in line to what we would be expectant of here in the 21st century. And so culturally, they read the Bible for themselves, states historian Paul Johnson, Via laws beginning in 1647, New England authorities mandated that public schooling be implemented. Okay. And then it goes on to boast about their literacy rate. Let's see here. In addition to religious-oriented grammar school education, New England was also at the forefront of higher education, with the founding of Harvard in 1636, states Middleton. All right, and so note, it's trying to convey a singular image, a positive image of New England, saying that they were ahead of their day. You also look, I've mentioned it before, David Hackett Fisher's book, and he looks at the demographics, the categories of the population. And he notices that a lot of people from the cities moved to the New England and northern states. And a lot of people back in the old world in Europe, particularly, moved from the countryside into the South. Okay. As far as at least the gentry who kind of controlled the South in Virginia. And so you're already getting into like the theme of like the Civil War, right? Of the North being at the forefront of change, being modern, right? Being progressive, and the South being kind of archaic, like back in the Stone Age, trying to live by a bygone era, a bygone code of ethics, etc. It's a simplistic way of looking at things, okay? And this is arguable, but this is kind of court history. Remember when a king or queen asked a court scribe to write history of him or her and or his or her kingdom, and of course that history book is going to make that emperor, king, queen look wonderful, right? Very likely, and so that's what court history does: is it praises those at the leadership realm in politics, and economics, and in culture. Politically, economically, and socially, what we would generically call the winners, those who got to dictate terms and led the colonies. It's praising them and saying that they were at the forefront of change. And you can't do this without having a lot of religion tied to it. This is part of the Protestant Reformation. So remember in the 1500s, you had Martin Luther, and he was, kind of obsessive compulsive disorder oriented, and never felt like he could do enough penance for his sins to avoid the fiery, torments of hell. And so then he claims to have had an epiphany that the Catholic Church was off on several points, and one of them being soteriology, the study of salvation, of how someone makes it to heaven, right? And so to him, he looks at the book of Romans, he looks at the book of Ephesians in the Bible, where St. Paul writes a lot about salvation being a gift that cannot be earned. And so he ties into those verses, Bible verses, right? And then what also doesn't do him very well is if salvation is something that cannot be earned, then what is the whole deal with the sacrament of reconciliation that they called penance back then in the Catholic Church, and of what import can be the idea of purgatory, of paying off your own sins, right, in a third realm besides heaven and hell after death. So he has no room for that. So he throws out the second book of Maccabees from the Catholic Bible that has 73 books, and 5 other books that were known as the Apocrypha, because when you go back to the synods of the religious bishops in the 300s, when they got together, they agreed on 66 books. They threw out quite a few that never made it into the Bible. And then with 7 apocryphal books, it was as if they put them in a special to the side category. They couldn't find consensus about those 7, not enough to throw them out and not enough to fully integrate them into the Bible. So they were kept as separate. But the second book of Maccabees, amongst those apocryphal books, gives a reference to a place that looks a lot like purgatory. So he just throws that out. And
What's
so
the word you're saying? Apocryphal?
Yeah, Apocrypha. It's APO. Oh gosh, I'm a terrible speller. Oh God, that doesn't look right. I'm going to give you the wrong spelling, I think. They're called the apocryphal books. It's
I just wanted to like look it up. I don't think I've ever heard that word.
yeah, it's APA or APO, CHRYPHA, something like that. Apocrypha, like to the side. But at any rate, so he differs with the Catholic Church on soteriology, and he challenges the Catholic hierarchy to a debate. And a head cardinal comes into Germany, where Martin Luther was as a monk, and tells him to step down and to recant, and refuses to have a debate with him. And then that really polarizes the church, especially in Germany. And then, of course, you can't take out the political parts to this too. Some people resented the power of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, right, known as a universal church, had a lot of its hands in a lot of lay or secular positions in Europe, right? And so some people opposed the Catholic Church. They took advantage of this Protestant Reformation, as it was called, for just political reasons. And then you also had the contention that on authority, right? Is, what constitutes authority for Christians? And you look back at a verse in the Gospels, right, where Jesus says, Simon, your name is now Petra, or Peter, right? And Petra means rock. And he says, and on this rock, I'm going to build my church. And so you have a famous letter to Clement of Rome, Clement. And Clement was the bishop of Rome after Peter was martyred in Rome as the first bishop of Rome, right? And so before Peter was martyred, Clement in the Catholic Church claimed to have a letter from Peter contending that as the keys to the church were given to him, he was now conceding that as an inheritance, if you will, to the next bishop of Rome, who was Clement. And it ought to go likewise to the next bishop and the next bishop, etc. And that's the notion of a main pontiff or a main vicar, vicar, a man's representative between man and Christ and God in the Trinity. And that's the notion of the Pope. And you had a guy named Irenaeus who was really big on that idea and pushed it forward. Irenaeus. And so they got together at a few synods. And of course, bishops were contending against that because you had Antioch, Corinth, Alexandria, Egypt, and other places where the bishops were jealously holding on to their power, and they didn't want to concede power to the bishop that was in Rome. But it obviously, by the medieval time period, it had caught credence throughout most of Europe, where most Christians, recognized the authority of the Pope as Peter's successor and vicar between man and God. And so, at any rate, there was a split in 1099 with the Eastern Orthodox Church, and they went a different direction, but they also remained very Catholic-like, right, with their rites or rituals. So to this day, when you go to the Catholic Church, when you go to arguably Protestant Catholic-like churches like the Episcopal Church, there is a set ritual that's followed, right? And oftentimes it's the clergy, the priests in particular, who have the authority to interpret the Bible and teach the Bible. And so, and they have the Episcopal form of church organization, where it's very hierarchical, where you have archbishops, and then you have so many bishoprics with bishops beneath them, and then you have so many dioceses of priests within each bishopric under a bishop. And so it's very hierarchical, right? With Martin Luther in the Reformation, he and other Protestant reformers protesting the Catholic Church, right? That's not actually protesting the Catholic Church, is not where the Protestant name came from. It came from a particular synod, something more particular that they were protesting, where the name caught on. But these Protestant reformers, right, they contended that authority ought to be in the Bible alone, okay? Not in the Pope, not in the religious hierarchy, but in the Bible alone. But herein was a dilemma for the Protestants, is that, okay, well, if they don't want the clergy alone to interpret the Bible, if they want the people themselves, because remember, the Bible was not circulated well. It was oftentimes printed the old school, like Jerome, Vulgate, and other versions where it was just in like, Latin. And so most people couldn't read it. They weren't educated and they didn't know the dead language of Latin. And so then there was a push to put the Bible in the vernacular, right? To put it in Spanish, to put it in English, to put it in German, etc., amongst the Protestants. But the dilemma is then, right, is what happens when people have different interpretations to the same verses, to the same Bible, even if they agree on the same 66 books or 73. In this case, it's 66 because the Protestants threw out the apocryphal books. And so at any rate, they find themselves with a dilemma there because they're going to argue with one another and split with one another over what certain things, the way certain things ought to be practiced and the way certain things ought to be believed. As far as practices, right? Okay, well, if they're going to take out the sacrament of reconciliation, or known as penance, because that's no longer necessary if you believe that, right, that salvation is a free gift that you can't earn. There's no use in doing penance to try to work off your sins if you believe that Christ died once and for all to forgive you of all your sins. What other sacraments are you going to throw out? Well, some Protestants said, okay, well, the instances of baptism in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, etc. I went to St. Mary's College, so I got a lot of religious studies that I had to take. Sorry, there's a lot of religion in this one. And so with the Protestants, right, is they said, okay, well, it seems like the instances of people being baptized, they were adults and they were freely conceding to their baptism and choosing it of their own, adult volition. And so some wanted to throw out infant baptism. And Martin Luther said, no, it's a free gift. What better example of it being a free gift than having a helpless baby be baptized? And so they fought over that. They fought over the Eucharist, right, which means giving thanks, the communion, right, with the bread and the wine. And some said, okay, when Jesus said, this is my body, we agree with the Catholic Church in transubstantiation. Transubstantiation, right, means that the Catholic Church believes that the bread and the wine change form and literally become the body and the blood of Christ that you're imbibing into your body. And to other Protestants, they said, no, I think it's symbolic. I think it's just meant as a symbol, and it continues to be bread and continues to be wine. And it's just, you just do it in remembrance as a solemn ceremony of remembrance and kind of initiation and for other symbolic reasons. And so the Protestants began fighting amongst one another and differing amongst one another. So suddenly you had a broad array of denominations that will eventually, that you see to this day in the United States alone, right? There are so many different non-Catholic Christian churches and denominations. So, Baptists and Methodists and Episcopalians, the Pentecostals, etc., right? And so at any rate, with these New Englanders, they were Protestants, okay? They wanted to make the church less Catholic-like and more what they thought was in line with first century Christianity. They oftentimes used the adjective pristine. They didn't want Rome or any hierarchy to mess up what the Bible said. They wanted to go back to the basics that you find in the book of Acts in the Bible, when the apostles are getting persecuted and spreading new churches after the death and proclaimed resurrection of Jesus. So at any rate, you find that dilemma especially with the Puritans. So there are two main groups, right, that came into New England. You had the Pilgrims who came in 1620, and they were separatists. They felt like the Anglican Church was beyond saving. because you have to remember, right? Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church. At least the main reason was because the Pope would not annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and he wanted to remarry. And so he broke away from Rome. He, at the time, at the beginning of the Reformation, had written in defense of the Catholic Church and in defense of Catholic beliefs, etc. And even at one time was seen as a defender of the Catholic Church over in England. And so if he went for personal reasons, right, then it stands to reason, it makes sense that his English or Anglican separated church was going to be very Catholic-like. And then, of course, he had Edward VI, I think it was, one of the Edwards. You had Queen Mary and others who were full-blown Catholic, who ascended the English throne and wanted the Anglican Church either to be as Catholic-like as possible. And of course, with Mary, even was interested in having the Anglican Church go back to Rome underneath the Pope. But then ultimately you have the reigns of people like Queen Elizabeth, who was Protestant and wanted to keep England separated from Rome. And again, there was an interplay. It wasn't just religion. It wasn't just doctrine, right? That sometimes predicated what their decisions would be, these people in power. It also sometimes was political. And so you had political wars and fights going on with Catholic Spain and with Rome itself. For one, right, is lay investiture, where a king or queen contends that he or she has the right to name the priest, the diocese, the clergyman in his or her realms within Mother England or within France, etc., right? And as the Pope might contend, right, that is his prerogative and his church's prerogative to name the clergyman in the diocese, etc., and set stuff up religiously in England, in Rome, or in England, in France, and places outside of Rome. And so that's just one example of a political component being, enmeshed into all of this drama. And so at any rate, you had the famous 1588 Armada of Spain, where very adamant, zealous Catholic Philip II of Spain tried to invade England and force England back under the Catholic Church. And the famous storm wiped out his armada, and it didn't happen. And England has been, at least nominally, institutionally, Protestant to this day. And so, so the those in New England and in England itself, right? And a lot of them tended to reside in the cities of Bristol, Liverpool, London, etc., who felt like they were, as the members of the bourgeoisie, the people of the city, that they were for that which seemed progressive, ahead of its time. And to them, it was archaic. It was too old school to recognize a pope and recognize a hierarchy, to keep the laity, the regular non-clergy people ignorant of the Bible, etc., but to have them instead be able to have access to a Bible in the vernacular language, to read it for themselves, to go to school and learn basic literacy, and read and interpret the Bible for themselves. Because to them, that was part of being, enlightened, if you will, right? Although the Enlightenment won't be until the 1740s. This is known in some ways as a precursor to the Enlightenment. And so with the separatists, they didn't see a prayer of reforming and making the Anglican Church more pristine, back to first century like Christianity. They felt like it was way too corrupt, way too political. It was beyond saving. So some of them just wanted to worship as they pleased, autonomously, as their own bosses over their own lives. And you have some people that came in and played a good villain, like Archbishop of Canterbury, who was kind of close to I wouldn't say a pope, but he was the lead bishop, and he automatically had political powers as the lead bishop. And this Archbishop of Canterbury could contend how people were to worship in church. And I think they were known as like the 39 Articles of Prayer or something like that. It's been a long time. But at any rate, Archbishop William Laud, Laud, when people did not go to church, did not go to mass, when they tried to meet separately and worship, in a different fashion, etc., he felt, amongst other things, that that was politically dangerous, that it was good to keep everyone under one unified institution, one unified culture, etc. And so he began to have people arrested, have them fined. And in some extreme cases, I don't know about under Archbishop William Laud, but there was a book, for instance, called Fox's Book of Martyrs, Foxe. And a guy named Fox wrote this, and it was about a book of Protestants who were killed under Catholic Queen Mary of England and her administration. And of course, it happened both ways. There were Catholic martyrs to Protestant crowns as well, but he didn't put that in his book, obviously. So it was very polemical, it was very political, and meant to provoke a sense of outrage amongst Protestants. And so you have instances of Protestants who were hardcore Protestants and wanted to be very un-Catholic-like, did not want to worship the way the Anglican Church mandated, and they were punished for that. So it made them look like they were being martyred, right? So this group of separatists, they decided to make a deal because they needed help financially through a joint stock company with whom they called strangers, people who were not church members of their denomination, right? That was meeting in secret, etc. And they were oftentimes, they got a lot of attention in a place called Scrooby, Scrooby. So at any rate, they left Scrooby and a couple other locales of England, and they joined money with strangers who were just trying to make money. And they went first to the Netherlands, because the Netherlands, also known as Holland, right? The people therein are known as Dutch. They got a lot of different titles. They went there because compared to other places, it was relatively tolerant in Dutch cities like Amsterdam and a place called Leiden, sometimes spelled Ley, sometimes spelled Leidan. A-N or E-N? I'm the worst speller, I'm sorry. So they went to Leiden, Netherlands for a few years and then left there and got permission through a joint stock company charter to come to present-day Massachusetts. And they landed at the famous Plymouth, right, in 1620. And so when they came there, they had the famous Thanksgiving in about a year from their landing with Massasoit and the Wampanoag Native American Confederacy. And they allied themselves in a military and political alliance against, namely, the Narragansett tribe that was threatening the Wampanoag tribe of Massasoit. So at any rate, they had the famous Thanksgiving, and they did go about 54 years. They went from 1620 when they landed to about 1674, having peace with the Wampanoag Confederacy and no wars with the tribes. And then they're going to have King Philip's War. His native name was Metacom, and he was the second successor after Massasoit that they're finally going to fight with. So we learned this as children, right? And that they wanted to worship as they pleased. They wanted autonomy. They wanted education for the kids, basic literacy. They were bourgeois, largely. They were from the cities of England. And so hence they were progressive, and they opened up a lot of economic diversity and trade. When you look at artisans, for instance, like skilled workers, so like coopers working with barrels, and cobblers making shoes, and those, the beginnings of the first mills later on, late in the colonial era, like the first factories, you're going to find them most often in the New England states. And to them, it's no coincidence, because they were open to that which was considered new, novel, right, ahead of its time. And so they're proud of that. And with all that business activity, you do have evidence of relative fluidity. of opportunities for a lot of people to rise up economically, because there were lots of different, diverse trades to get involved into to try to make money. Also, the New Englanders, they oftentimes allotted land by necessity. And so they were seen as being kind of ahead of their time, whereby they wanted a limited, regulated capitalist economy. They wanted private ownership of land, free enterprise, right, as far as doing that which you consider in your economic self-interest and the freedom to do such. But they put limitations. They put limitations on prices. They put limitations on how much acreage you could buy, because they wanted arguably to have somewhat of an Aristotle-like middle-class society. And so all that is being boasted about on number one. Now, the group after them that came 10 years later in 1630, above them geographically, mainly into Boston, were known as the Puritans. So notice they're used interchangeably as New Englanders, but they were different. A different group, different individuals, different culture, different institutions. The Puritans came in much larger numbers, and they were much more arguably controversial than their Pilgrim forebears. So when the Puritans came, they wanted to purify the Anglican Church, but they wanted to do it, ironically, 3,000 miles across an ocean. So John Winthrop and others contended that they were going to create a city upon the hill, right? They were going to create a perfect democratic Christian theocracy here in the New World, that they were going to spread the word of God and the gospel to the last part of the earth, not yet, quote, discovered. And I put a major quote on that, right? Because the natives were living here long before. But that they were going to spread the word, and that hence, right, going back to their religion, that, Christ told the apostles, right, preach the gospel to all the corners of the earth. And in the book of Revelation, St. John contended that Jesus would come back. And that's where you get all the dramatic showdown, right, between God and the devil and their armies. And so they believed that they actually were going to expedite or speed up the return of Christ, because they assume that Christ is just waiting for everybody to have a chance to hear the gospel in the world before he comes back, so they have a chance to turn to him and be saved. And so they actually believed they were bringing about the second coming, in coming over here and spreading the gospel and demonstrating to the world that you could have a very a democratic, Bible-oriented commonwealth that ought to be replicated and will be envied by the rest of the world, and people will try to follow suit. So they had high pretensions, they had high hopes. And even to a Catholic historian like Paul Johnson, to him, he praises their idealism, right? And to me, an idealist is someone who doesn't see the world as it is. He or she sees the world as it ought to be. An idealist wants to improve the world. I think of like Martin Luther King Jr., right? As an idealistic person. As a contrast to that, I would think of like a pragmatic person. And a pragmatic person is like, no, I see the world and all its darkness and reality and how it really is, and I'm just going to change my hopes. I'm going to formulate my moral compass around those realities and just do what works within the messy now and now. Not so much an idealist. An idealist says, you know what, I understand there's a lot of ugliness in the world, but I'm still going to focus on a grand goal, on a grand destination that I'm going to try to take humanity to. Okay. So this is all court history on number one. It's praising both the Pilgrims and the Puritans as New Englanders, contending that they were at the forefront of change and that they had good intentions, etc. All right. So any questions so far?
Thank you for all your awesome information.
I don't know about that, but thank you.
Was that like a backstory to this paragraph?
It was. It
Oh,
was.
you're awesome. Okay. Thank you.
No problem. So yeah, I've just given you some context to this. And so look at this next paragraph. New England authorities incorporated into their religious and political institutions practices considered more democratic, right? More democratic than those found in the royal colonies. All right. Their church organization was congregational, each church being independent of presbyters, of elders or bishops from outside their own community. And pastors were elected and removed by popular vote amongst the parishioners, amongst the church members. All church members could apply for clergy positions and all could run for office, as the church members set themselves under common citizenship status since the signing of the Mayflower Compact. So they decided in the Mayflower Compact, when they were still out on the harbor of Mayflower, oh my goodness, my brain, I'm sorry, Plymouth, just when they were outside of Plymouth and they still had not yet come ashore, 44 heads of households of men and members of the church decided that they were going to agree upon a representative body for one another that they would adhere allegiance to. And so when you look at the actual writing, it's not so much pledging for democratic government, it's pledging for representative government, right? For them to be properly represented by those who will look after everyone. So it's like, it's limited. In 1620, it does read as kind of a progressive document of stating, right, that we're giving our consent for a government to represent us, right? And when you get later to the Enlightenment, for instance, you have something known as the social contract, the idea that the consent of the governed, right? That the government is not our master, but our servant. And it's justified in ruling over us only by our permission. So yeah, I could see that. But again, it's not specifically stating that the common person gets to participate in government. It didn't go that far. Okay. So it's kind of arguable how democratic it was. But as far as, kind of notions, the outlining of a social contract that will become popular later in the 1740s, okay, I subjectively would give some credence to that. So, okay, and so let's see here. Prohibition of predatory business practices. So again, like limited, regulated capitalism. And of course, with the progressive movement in the 1890s and the first couple of decades of the 1900s, this had become big. So is this another example of them being ahead of their time? And then, like I mentioned, at their time period, it was very normal to be in a state of diplomatic Cold War or outright war with Native Americans and other colonies. And they lasted 54, 55 years before doing such. Also, the famous praying towns like John Eliot and other missionaries, so from what I understand, from what I've read of the primary and secondary sources, they were volitional. They didn't force them to convert. They let them choose. And so with these praying towns like on Deer Island and these other islands and so forth, they would put Native Americans who chose to learn English, to chose to become Christians and baptized, etc. I wouldn't go so far as say that they fully integrated them and allowed them to have all the rights of Christians, etc. That would be too far. But like I said, it was volitional, and there were certain rights and opportunities that were given to the praying Indians, as they were called, should they choose of their own volition. So when you look at it, it wasn't too much of a, arguably, relative to other colonies in the 1600s, it wasn't too combative or too coercive of an atmosphere between the Euro-Americans, right, of European heritage and the Native Americans. So number one, putting that together, I'm bragging about all that stuff, right? And contending that the Pilgrims and Puritans were ahead of their day. Also in science, by the way, they were amongst the first to use vaccines and somewhat at the forefront of the hard sciences and medicine. But notice the second paragraph, right? Or the second section, intolerant New England. So I do a 180 on number 2, right? I say, oh, come on now. And I know that's probably gets old, me doing that. But I always want you to, I'm very adamant that I'm not ever trying to indoctrinate anybody. I want to try to inform you on certain topics. I want to introduce you to certain debates that are going on and let you think for yourselves. Okay. So seeing another side to things, right? You see a side in particular of the Puritans who came 10 years later and came into Boston, right? The Puritans are going to be here from 1630. By the time of 1636, even according to the primary sources, their war with the Pequot, P-E-Q-U-O-T, was arguably very avoidable. But yet they had it within 6 years of landing. All right. In that war, they're going to have the famous Fort Mystic, M-Y-S-T-I-C, massacre. And it makes them look horrible. They lit the village on fire. And when the natives tried to run for their survival, they cut down everyone that ran out of the fire that they could. And they did not discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. And there's an argument, right, that the Catholic Church had notions of just war, right, of what constitutes a justifiable, even religiously holy war. And they put it in 2 categories, the Catholic Church did. And by the way, this is kind of morphed into modern UN sanctions to this day. Your reasons for fighting the war and the manner by which you fight it. The reasons for which, right? Well, you can make the argument that both were in almost this ego contest for hegemony, for domination. They and the Pequot. And it's a wonder they didn't fight with the Narragansett, who are a mighty tribe, namely in Connecticut, in Rhode Island. But at any rate, they wanted, unlike the Pilgrims beneath them, the Puritans wanted people to pay tribute to them as their overlord. So they diplomatically bullied people. All right. The Pequot refused. That arguably led to some tension. Another thing that led to tension, and by the way, William Bradford and other Pilgrims wrote some of this stuff down. Some of their own English Christian neighbors, right, gave us some information that does not make the Puritans look good. There also seems to have been a bit of hubris, right? The old Greek word, H-U-B-R-I-S, arrogance that leads you to believe that the rules that apply to other people don't apply to you because you're just more special, you're more powerful. So hence, the Puritans were bad to have a double standard. If a Native American committed a crime, even if it were in Native American territory, under their own sovereign government and their own sovereign separate laws, right? But that which was considered a crime against an Englishman, they wanted justice, and they wanted justice to be put into their hands and let the authorities, the judges, etc., in the Boston area to mete that justice out. But when Christian English Americans committed crimes against Native Americans, even in Native American territories, they seem to have wanted to do nothing as far as cooperation and giving the Native Americans justice. There was a case, and I beg your pardon, I can't recall the guy's name, but there was an Englishman down in Plymouth who was convicted for murdering a Native American. And Plymouth, right? We have this in their primary sources, the Pilgrims. They stated that not only would God want justice in colorblind fashion, but that it would be good for relations with the Wampanoag Confederacy if they could see that the paleface, the white man, was willing to deal justly for them on their behalf, that it could help as far as peaceful relations between Native Americans and Englishmen.
If they did what? I'm sorry.
If the Native Americans could see that the English were willing to punish their own who were guilty of committing crimes against Native Americans, it would do well for relations in the future. If they could see, right, that the English were practicing universal justice and not discriminating. So you have two parties, right? And they're very different in their ancestry. They're very different in their culture. And they're precariously trying to live side by side. It's good for the one side, right? When a member of one community commits a crime against that other community, it's better for the perpetrator's own society to punish him, to show their goodwill toward the other group. So this gentleman, I could let you know in a future Zoom. I have it in one of my books. I can't recall it at the moment. But this gentleman was hanged by his own Plymouth authorities for killing the Native American. The Puritans, I have not read of them being willing to do anything that even approximated that. They were much more arrogant. And so there was a guy named like Captain John Stone and a handful of others who they contended, the Narragansett, the Pequot, and other tribes contended were abducting and extorting Native American children. They were taking Native American children, threatening to kill them or sell them off to slavery if the Native Americans didn't pay them a certain fee. And the Puritans would do nothing to punish them. So I believe it was John Stone and two others in a short period of time. There were three of them who were eventually murdered by Native Americans. And the Puritans demanded that the suspects be handed over to Boston. And everyone knew what they were going to do. They were going to hang them. The Pequot leaders, the Sachems, the chiefs, they said no. And that was one of the final sparks that led to the Pequot War. So the Puritans, right, they had very, sketchy reasons for going to war. Once they went to war, like at Fort Mystic Massacre, they were bloody. And there was another fight just generically called the Great Swamp Fight that you could look up. And in the Great Swamp Fight, the Narragansett were occupying that area, and they were not at war with New England authorities. And New England soldiers came in and killed everybody they could catch and didn't chase out. And one of the Narragansett members, bless his heart, he posted a paper of their piece with an Narragansett to show it, to put it in their face, you know, as it was nailed to the tree. Hey guys, we're supposed to be your ally, and you just attacked our village. It was known as the Great Swamp Fight. But the argument is, right, is that the Euro-Americans, in times of war especially, that while they absolutely engaged arguably, but they engaged in divide and conquer tactics, where they would make peace with one tribe and fight with another tribe, right? Because after all, they sure as heck don't want to fight all the natives combined. While they did that, very often when they went to war, they contended that Native Americans were devil-like. They were following the devil, whether they knew it or not. They were savage. They didn't adhere to the dictates of conscience and to the Catholic Church's notions of just war fighting. And so hence, if you see a quote Indian, kill them. And they didn't discriminate between tribes when they fought in some of these wars. And an example of that especially is King Philip's War, or Metacom's War, Metacom. And even with Metacom, right? Yeah.
Were they still like, at this time period, were they still like sacrificing their best sheep and like practicing like medicinal, what do you call them? Like medicinal rituals? Were the Native Americans still practicing? Like, is that why the Christians came and thought they were into witchcraft, because they were working with the elements of the universe?
No, absolutely. Absolutely.
Or why they think they were into witchcraft?
Yeah, because it's kind of the same as in Virginia, right? It's for all their talk of assimilating the Native Americans and making Christians of them to bring about the second coming of Christ. There were not a lot of efforts to do that. The English became very notorious, unlike the Spanish, for not intermarrying with and integrating with the Native Americans. They oftentimes made deals and slowly began pushing the Native Americans further and further west, and they remained for quite a bit of time just uncomfortable neighbors with just tentative peace treaties. So the Native Americans absolutely continued to adhere.
So they kind of just came and shook them up a little bit.
Yeah.
Quite a bit, kind of displaced them.
For sure. And that's what Metacom basically went to war for, is he felt like his father, Massasoit, had been taken advantage of, especially in his old age. As Massasoit got older, he began to sell more and more of the land to the English. And he felt like he was being tricked and that he was becoming a bit senile in old age, and that the English were taking advantage of that. And then he had an older brother whose Christian name was Alexander. I can't remember his native name, but his older brother too, he felt was a pushover. And so he kind of vowed to himself that once his brother stepped down or died, he wasn't going to put up with this English exploitation. And so when he first came in, he went to Plymouth and he had a list of demands. And among them were for settlers to get out of the Connecticut River Valley. The Connecticut River Valley was a very fertile area, supposedly, for farming and fishing and hunting. And it was very coveted by the English. And they were just coming in illegally and squatting, or contending that they had their own private negotiations with the tribes, some of which were true, many of them were not. And instead of Plymouth promising to kick their squatters out of the Connecticut River Valley and adhering to some of Metacom's demands, they said, look at this guy. He's behaving as if he's King Philip of France, or of Spain, Philip II, who tried to invade England. So they thought, this guy doesn't have that much power, and he's walking around as if he is the mighty King Philip II of Spain. So they basically demeaned him. They even made him sit at another table and demeaned him. Or I'm sorry, that was another guy. That was a Narragansett sachem named Miantonomi. But in both cases, with Miantonomi and Metacom, they could have tried to placate their anger as Native American leaders. And in both cases, instead, they wounded their pride. They humiliated them. They emasculated them publicly. And in the short run, with both gentlemen, they paid a price for it, because both gentlemen decide to rise up against them. Miantonomi of the Narragansett, and especially Metacom of the Wampanoag. So not only were they intolerant and they were not that progressive, right? You could make the argument from number 2 and how they treated Native Americans, but they also arguably were not tolerant to one another. So right here, right? As for domestic, right, within the Euro-American communities themselves, not with neighbors. As for domestic Puritan relations, a picture of exclusivity, intolerance, and even tyranny can be supported. So that's meant to be a big point. All right. So for one, the covenant, this idea, right? On the one hand, you have the individual realm. And in the individual realm, a lot of the New Englanders were Calvinists. They believed that mankind is so depraved, he's so touched by original sin, right? The notion that the moment Adam and Eve sinned, that it's like something began when, because they're supposed to live forever, right? In the Garden of Eden. And when they sinned, mortality hit their bodies. One son kills another shortly thereafter, right? And so kind of all hell breaks loose, if you will, in biblical doctrine and stuff. And so the notion of original sin, you have it like in the book of Romans, I believe it is, with St. Paul, where it contends that sin lives in him and he is a servant to his master, sin, that sin reigns in his flesh, in his body, and he needs to be delivered from that by Christ and by the Holy Spirit. So hence, without Christ and without Holy Spirit, original sin is the notion that people have a natural inclination to sin, to do the opposite of what God in the Bible would want them to do. Okay? But so that when we die, we technically all are guilty of sin, and we all deserve hell. We committed the crime, and we deserve the punishment. But they take verses like from the book of Ephesians in the Bible, and they believed, John Calvin and others, that God decides to reveal himself to certain people, to a select group, and offer them forgiveness. But that God, must make the move himself, that we're helpless, that we're not only so sinful, but that sin hardens our heart and corrupts our mind, that we can't even choose to make the first move toward God if we wanted to, because we wouldn't want to. So God must do it. but in choosing some people to reveal himself to and to forgive and to move within their hearts to change and repent of their sinful behavior, he also simultaneously chooses not to intervene with other people. So to this day, I don't know of Calvinism known as predestination, right? That we're predestined. God has already decided who he's going to approach and forgive and who he's going to leave alone and allow to suffer for our sins after death. I really don't know of this still being a viable, embraced doctrine, even amongst Protestant churches. But that's what the New Englanders adhered to. All right. But then separate from the private realm is the public realm. And in the public realm, right, you don't just answer for your own sins, but the community itself as an entire entity answers for that community's own sins. So I think you know where I'm going with this. If you live in my community and I began veering off, taking drugs, harming other people, engaging in immorality, and quite a few other gentlemen do as well, God might punish Modesto, California, because of the miscreant behavior of myself and the other group of guys. He might punish all of us as a community together, collectively. So hence, they had that notion, and they got it from like the Old Testament of the Bible, right? With the Hebrews, with God's chosen people, the Jews, right? In the Bible, is that God tells them through Moses and Aaron and others in the Old Testament. I know there's a lot of religion today. If your community, if you people, the Hebrews, obey my 10 commandments, right, and adhere to my laws, then I will bless your community. I'll protect you from disease. I'll protect you from enemies and warfare. I'll bless your farming and your economics, your economy. I'll protect you from, various other variables that are outside your control. But conversely, if I see a lot of sin in your community, then I'm going to take my protective hand off of you. And I'm going to allow you to fall at the mercy of your enemies in warfare. I'm going to allow disease to come in, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So at any rate, what doesn't help, right, whether you understand this, much less believe this, right, is the idea is no matter how true or false that is, right, when there is a perception that seems to be buttressed, like supported by data that they're bringing in, it just feeds the monster. So for instance, just before King Philip's War, the Plymouth and Puritan authorities, the Puritans especially, began bemoaning the immorality in their own society. They contended that the second and third generations were not holy like the first generation. Their kids and grandkids, the religion didn't set in like it did for the grandparents. You have some crazy cases, you guys. I don't mean to be gross, but you had a guy publicly punished for having sexual relations with animals. And so things that the Puritans were just absolutely, shocked by. And so much so that you not only have a lot of sermons against the alleged immorality that was happening amongst them and concerns about such, right? But you even had a change in that which was considered required for citizenship. See, before in the first generation, they were exclusive. you had to somehow prove to the church authorities that you had been born again, right? Remember in the gospel accounts, Jesus tells Nicodemus that if you want to go to heaven, you have to be born again. Well, a subjective metaphysical experience like that, how in the world do you prove that? You somehow had to convince the leaders that you had been born again. You had to have letters of rec, basically, from other people contending that you, since this born again experience, had become a holier, better person, right? You had to adhere to their same Calvinistic beliefs about salvation and other fundamental beliefs that they had to have a chance. You had to have a pristine reputation. And oh, by the way, the church hired people with that notion of the covenant as overseers. They were called select men, to come and spy on you in your homes to see what you were up to. So it was a very rigorous test. Then if you were allowed as a full church member, then you could be a full citizen. All right. So at any rate, they relaxed that just prior to Metacom's war, because they said, if we keep these rigorous expectations, criteria for citizenship, no one's going to be a citizen.
Isn't it like Jehovah's Witnesses? Sounds exactly like it.
You know what? I'm so ignorant of that denomination. I'm sorry, Melissa. I couldn't even begin to.
I was hoping so bad. Well,
Yeah,
it's like a branch off of Seventh-day Adventist, and I would say Mormon, but not. It's like Mormon's brother.
Yeah, to be honest, I know a little bit more of the Mormons, but yeah, I couldn't begin to answer that on Jehovah's Witnesses. Very ignorant of that denomination, its basic creed, etc. If someone else wants to chime in, that's great. I also, like I said, with religion, I like to be informative and give you context. And then anything that hits contemporary stuff, I start getting very nervous, because I'm your instructor, and I don't want to lean one way or another. I don't want to lead you one direction or another. We are a public school. Okay, so I will also I'll have this posted as soon as I can. Okay. So good. All right. So let's see here. So they relaxed it, right? Their requirements, and it was known as the half covenant. And then shortly after that, they had Metacom's war. And in Metacom's war, it was scary. It was scary because to the Native Americans, right, when they decide upon war, they don't declare it first, according to European Catholic standards. They don't discriminate at times between combatants and non-combatants that the church had for centuries told, right? That you fight the guy in the uniform with the sword or the gun, not the woman holding her child. And so in some of these cases, especially in Metacom's war, King Philip's war, the Native Americans began attacking settlers in certain regions that were unprotected, and they killed women and children and the elderly. And so news spread, and of course, that is going to demonize the natives, right? That they're awful, they're killing women and children, etc. But it just kind of buttressed their belief, right? That God is angry with us, and this is the punishment of God, right? This whole covenant stuff. For our organization, our society's sins. So my point being here, right, that I'm doing in a long-winded fashion, is that with the covenant notion, is they were not very big on individual autonomy, on you being the decider, the arbiter of your own lifestyle. They very much got into your business. and could be very intolerant. All right. And they did very much adhere to corporal punishment, to bodily punishment. And it wasn't always, public whipping, but sometimes it was shaming. The pillory and other things, right? You've seen those things perhaps, especially if you've traveled to the Salem area of Massachusetts. You stick your hands and your head through the holes in the wood plank, and you're there for everyone to vilify and make fun of and mock. They could humiliate you in a myriad of ways, publicly punish you. And the big words were repent of your bad behavior or recant, and that is change your way of thinking and expression. So you had Anne Hutchinson, right? God forbid a woman having her own Bible studies. And in those Bible studies, she more than suggested that the devil, right, comes disguised as an angel of light, and that very likely some of the Puritan leaders themselves were secret agents of the devil sent to lead the people astray. So for that and other reasons, right, and other things that she expressed, she was publicly reprimanded and told to recant her ideas. She refused, and they banished her and told her they would kill her if she returned. Yeah. Another individual was Roger Williams. And Roger Williams was he was more of a paradox. Anne Hutchinson, from the primary sources, you could see her coming from a mile. She was a woman who was very outspoken, and you knew where she stood on virtually every issue, and she would not waver. And she was proud of being anti-establishment. Roger Williams was a well-connected, well-respected man, had a reputation for sobriety and humility. But he fought for the rights of natives to keep their land. He fought for a separation of church and state. And for other reasons, they told him to publicly recant. He said no, and they expelled him as well. He moved south to Rhode Island from Boston and used his good reputation to gain a charter and his connections to gain a charter to start a colony in Rhode Island. Had a superb, from the primary sources at least, a superb relationship with the Narragansett and other tribes. So much so that when King Philip's War erupted, he supposedly came in the midst of a battle, telling the Narragansett not to kill. And they were killing. It got where it was just, like I mentioned, with the Great Swamp Fight, where English Euro-Americans were killing Native Americans on the spot, and Native Americans were killing white-skinned, pale-face people on the spot. And they didn't lay a hand on him. Such was his relationship with them and their respect for him, that he was not harmed in the process of walking unarmed in the midst of a battle, telling people on both sides to put down their weapons. And one of the first things he did in Rhode Island under his new constitution, he separated church and state and issued an edict on religious toleration. And he contended that Boston, Puritan Boston, was his anti-model. What he absolutely was trying to do different from. Yes.
When they separate the church from state, it kind of allowed for no accountability within the church or the congregation for like the behavior and stuff, right? Because then it made the actual governing body the clergymen that they picked.
That's a good question. I mean, technically then, right? When you have the separation of church and state, for one, there are no automatic connections between citizenship and church membership like you had in New England, like you had in Puritan Boston. And so that dilemma didn't happen as often. A lot of times the clergymen were not connected to a political office. And so they were, like you said, they were responsible for chastising their own members, their own church members.
So did they come up with their own rules for the congregation aside from the Bible, or because the Bible's kind of broad on a lot of the scripture on the rules and things like that?
Yeah, and that's just the thing, right? Especially when you get into a modern context, right? It's so subjective. You have things, like don't, if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. And I don't think anybody believes Jesus meant to do that literally, right? But was saying, right, that if you have a habit or something that tempts you to do something very sinful, stay away from that habit, right? If you're an
Why is so
alcoholic,
much
stay
of the
away from
Bible?
alcohol.
This
But
movie so good.
but today,
But
right?
why is so much? The Bible is like super metaphoric, right? Like, so
That's the thing is some are meant to be allegory, some are meant to be metaphors, some verses, and that's exactly why people still believe in having a what's the word? There's a technical word for it, like seminary, where people are to learn to discern those differences. When Jesus or others, right, quoted in the Bible, were meant to be, their words meant to be taken literally and not meant to be taken literally. And you run that risk when you have some of your clergymen, especially denominations like the Baptist, at one time the Methodists. I don't think so anymore, but in their early origins, they were proud of having uneducated pastors, and they weren't technically trained with that kind of stuff. And you run the risk of really going off on tangents, not knowing the proper intent of different verses, etc. And that does seem to be a Protestant dilemma, because their rhetoric is so egalitarian that Bobby should be able to sit in his living room and read his own scripture and come to his own conclusions on his couch, right? But when Bobby meets with 100 other people at a church and they all begin disagreeing and decided on who to elect as their pastor, it can get messy, for sure. But it was meant to be, right, under colonies like Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Rhode Island, where they established religious toleration. That was meant to be a domestic dispute. Let the church members fight that out amongst one another. And notice that, but of course, within reason, right? Now they are not sanctioned to engage in corporal punishment that seems to exceed the civic law. So sometimes they made laws that you're not to be lashed more than 39 times with a whip. You sure as heck can't publicly execute any members of your church any longer, with the sanction of the government, because you committed a religious and not a civic crime. So it did, in some ways, kind of take some power away from the churches as far as what they can do with their own parishioners. But at the same time, it also, to a lot of people, was embraced as being liberating by pastors like Roger Williams, and more synonymous with individual liberty and so forth, with a more modern republic. So then in line to that idea of a bit of hysteria at times, intolerance, what better example, right, than the Salem witch trials? So that's not an argument in of itself. Notice I put not a section to do nor on test, but I just said it's optional reading if you wanted to read the basics of the Salem witch trials. Fun stuff. Fun stuff. What I think is interesting is the different theses that have been brought forward and became very popularly embraced in public discourse. None of them have really stuck definitively. So for one, right, is that it was in a state of hysteria. They went after the marginal, right? Those who didn't fit in and those who did not conform to Puritan normative behavior codes and to customs, etc. But you find some very well-established people who were persecuted in those witch trials. Some say that it was very misogynist, that most of those involved and suffered were women. And women had, there's a very good book called Damned Women on this subject, if you wanted to look into it, and showing how women were seen as not only inferior and more weak physically, but they were seen as more weak spiritually as well, that they could be more easily seduced by the devil. And so, yeah, so, but then again, you have some well-connected men who suffered in these trials. So the thesis doesn't fit perfectly. And then you also have the opposite of the marginalized thesis, that people who were more marginalized in the Salem village were trying to scapegoat people that they envied and resented in Salem town, more well-established people, and use this as kind of a weapon of vengeance, if you will. But that pattern doesn't fit neatly across the board either.
I'm sorry, what was the last part you said? They were doing what?
So the last one is the opposite of the marginal women and marginal people getting scapegoated. Some people go the opposite route, and they find a lot of evidence of people that are poor in the Salem village trying to accuse people who are more well-to-do in Salem town.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And so I think you could find individual instances to back up each of those theses, but not a single one covers, all the data perfectly. It was messy, like life is. All right, and then we have Pennsylvania, the next two on Pennsylvania and William Penn, great man history. Remember, that doesn't necessarily mean that you believe the person is a great human being. It means that you believe events happen because of the behavior and decisions made by people in great positions of power. And you focus on the leaders. So some great man history on numbers 3 and 4. So as I put here, number 3 is court history. It praises William Penn. He went out of his way to try to keep peace with Native Americans. He had annual diplomatic fairs, if you will, that the people of Pennsylvania would meet with the Susquehannock and the Illinois and all these other tribes and try to go to peacefully, especially when it came to land acquisitions, to make sure that everything was agreed upon by all parties and there was no reason for friction, resentment, or war. Okay. You also have evidence of William Penn going out of his way to send literature to very marginalized areas in Europe, people that didn't have the same opportunities that others had, poor marginalized groups. So the Bohemians, the Czechs, the Albanian gypsies, some of the poor Germans in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in France, not just in England. This guy was deliberately trying to bring in, supposedly, a motley, diverse group, and in particular, a group of people that were not doing too well in Europe, and give them a better chance in Pennsylvania. When they got here, you have more almshouses in Pennsylvania than anywhere else. And an almshouse is like a gospel mission place, right? But it's funded by the government, whereby the homeless come, they can find food and quarter, they're taught a skill, and they try to get them on their feet economically with these almshouse organizations. Land. Not only the fertility of the land in Pennsylvania, which gained a great reputation, but the price of land was relatively cheaper, and you got more bang for your buck as far as the fertility of that land than virtually anywhere else in the colonies. Also, access to credit. And you can find evidence for William Penn actively working behind the scenes to try to ensure this. There was arguably more access to business loans in Pennsylvania than in any other colony. You look at his Charter of Liberties in the early 1680s. He guarantees freedom of conscience. He promises the rights of subjectship, all the rights of Englishmen, whether you're English or not. And remember, with English citizenship, oftentimes it was just sanguine by blood. You had to have at least one of your parents born in England. That was one of the two major criteria. The other one is that you had to have been born in the British realm. Well, a lot of these didn't fit that, right? They were born outside of Great Britain, and they were not of English heritage with their parents. And he nevertheless promised them citizenship rights. So you had Dutch Moravians, you had German Baptists and Mennonites, and other unpopular Protestant denominations came into Pennsylvania. Now, the argument is also, though, is that it was more like modern day worldview. It was more of a mosaic than it was a melting pot, too. A lot of the people that came in, especially the different religious denominations, they kind of clustered amongst one another. They got their business loans and lands from one another and their business contacts and jobs. They were not really good statistically to intermarry. Oftentimes they engaged in endogamy, marrying within your own demographic. But they were there chasing after the American dream. Many of them arguably attaining it or approximating it in colonial Pennsylvania. William Penn followed the diplomacy of the Native Americans when he met with them. He smoked the peace pipe with them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Approximating. What does that mean?
Approximating, it means at least approaching the American dream. Because, right, that's kind of an elusive thing, right? The American dream. Rising up socially, rising up economically to a level of comfort, realizing your dreams as far as what you do for a living and how much you make. So at least approximating that, right? At least approaching it. Because yeah, the American dream is kind of nebulous, huh? It's trying to kind of arguably trying to grab a hold of a cloud. I'm thinking like a beatnik later in your 102 class, the beatniks of the 1950s. They said, what is the American dream anyway? So at any rate, so going back to this, why did he do all this? And not only that, he had near dictatorial powers when he was granted the charter as the proprietor or owner of colonial Pennsylvania. He had right to make the laws, enforce the laws, and adjudicate who had violated the laws and what the punishment would be thereof. So he had legislative, executive, and judicial powers, all in one person. like a medieval baron. He was seen as the proprietor of all that land. So on paper, when you bought land from him, it was usufruct, right? It was, you could use that land. You were basically a renter, even when you were buying that land. And he could demand rent payments from you, known as quitrents. And that was a very old school thing. So he got arguably a very kind of archaic, old charter granted to him, giving him a lot of power. Because the king had owed his father money for raising up a private army and helping fight for him in the past. The father died, and now he considered it owed to the son, William. But why does he do this? According to court history, predominantly, it was his religious conversion. He became a Quaker Christian. And the before-after dichotomy is found in a lot of old biographies on him. That before his conversion, he led a very superficial lifestyle. Chasing after women, a good time, consumerism, ostentatious display of his wealth, just showing it off. Supposedly, after he becomes a Quaker, what's one of the biggest Christian virtues that the Quakers were really big on? A couple of them that come to mind personally, just from what I've read of the Quakers. One is humility. I'm going to say three, I'm sorry. Two is charity. And three is meekness. And remember, meekness, you are humble and selfless and chivalric with whatever power you have. Recognizing that the power you have comes from God, and you're going to be held responsible for that power, how you used or abused it. So as a good, meek Quaker, right? He's given all this land. He's given all this political power, and he decides to share it. All because he had now become a good Quaker. Because, by the way, he's going to recognize a two-branch legislator that will make the laws, but reserves for himself veto power over it. Right? So a good Quaker, but maybe not a saint. So number three praises him. That William Penn, because of his religious experience, right, deliberately created Pennsylvania as a land of opportunity and participation for the people. All right.
Isn't necessarily really religious. It sounds like he was like more like a heart guy. Like just being a good guy.
Yeah.
Was he pushing religion though? What was their religion?
No, to be honest, he wasn't. Now you can find evidence, however, of him wanting to maintain the political influence of major Quaker authorities, right? Who were elected into the assembly and a part of the upper branch. For sure, you could find plenty of evidence of that, of him kind of playing power politics and wanting to make sure that a significant number of Quakers stayed in key positions, for sure. He also, while he didn't politically adhere publicly to the covenant notion that New England had, he may have privately believed it, because he felt, right, that sins are not only offensive to God as a religious man, but he felt like sins breed conflict, right? So hence, you could get in trouble for public ostentation of your wealth. Can you believe that? So if you had too fancy of a carriage, riding it around through poor neighborhoods, you could be fined for it. I kid you not. Public swearing, you could get in trouble for that. Public inebriation, right? Being publicly drunk, you could be fined for that. So he had certain religious laws that he made into civic law. But you could also make the argument that, especially compared to New England, that the punishments for them were rather lenient compared to the punishments found in New England. So let's see here. Then with number 4, they say, you know what? I got to hand it to him. You have court history of people like George Washington, right? And other people that just selects the data conveniently that portrays them in a positive light and leaves out the other stuff that future historians gain a hold of, right? And they want to revise that rose-colored image, and they're called revisionist historians, right? I got to hand it to William Penn. He has handled the storm of revisionist historians long after his death pretty darn well, whereby you could still find modern, up-to-date historiographically, right, books, biographies that still praise him considerably compared to a lot of other figures in American history. But nevertheless, he was a human being, right? So number 4, I'm saying, no, this guy was a puzzle. He was an enigma. Okay, he went through all of this grand diplomacy with Native Americans. By the way, he was the only governor to say he was not going to have a militia, because he said there'd be no reason to fight with the Native Americans and that God will protect us. So he had no standing army. And he didn't want to, and he also felt like that would serve as a threat and a menace in the eyes of the natives. So he does those things, right? But at the same time, what was the name in the Algonquian language that the Native Americans gave to him? Onus or Mekon, and it meant feather or quill pin. So the natives are saying, right? Basically, every time we see this guy, we identify him with some contract he wants us to sign. This guy's always trying to buy more and more of our land, and he won't stop bugging us about it. You have tribes that progressively sold the majority of their tribal lands for short-term goals, to become the middlemen with certain commodities, providing certain commodities at a high price, right? But there's evidence that he knew full well that in the short run, that was going to be very harmful for them because they have lost their land. They have no land, right? There's no evidence of him losing sleep over that I've come across. So he showed this great respect for the Native Americans, but he almost parasitically wanted to constantly buy more and more land from them and didn't care about what the long-term consequences of that would be for them. He had credit available, cheap land available, almshouses available for a lot of, formerly marginalized people from Europe coming here. But he still had an inner circle that engaged in the fur trade and didn't even share it with the public, the information, much less his profits. Some of the best land in Philadelphia itself, he reserved for himself and his buddies. He kept the veto power over the legislator. Granted, he only used it a couple times, and one of the two was actually to defend the natives from a policy that would have hurt them. But still, he was a consummate businessman. So that it's unfair, to the point of being a bit erroneous, to say that it was his generosity that led him to die indebted. That a lot of that was a result of his own business dealings. Yeah, he shared power with the legislator. He had the Quakers no longer, not the established elite of the colony, by having a proclamation on religious toleration. But he was constantly getting pressured by people who called him the Prince of Pennsylvania, and that he better share his power, and that he better not try to cram the Quaker agenda down the people's throats. And you could say the same, arguably, for Lord Baltimore in Maryland, when he granted, as a Catholic governor of Maryland, of the only Catholic colony, he granted religious freedom and separation of church and state with Protestants, but they threatened to kill him before he did it, literally. So there was pressure on William Penn too. It wasn't just freely made of his own volition to share this power. So hence, right, I say, okay, he was still a human being. He was a puzzle of a man. He was almost saintly in some ways, but he still seemed to kind of look out for number one, even in old age. Then the last one. We're almost done. Thank you, guys. This is an especially long one, you guys. I'm going to give you 10 points at the end. I'm going to go back over the names. I'm going to give you 10 points instead of 5 extra for this, okay? You've earned it. Then New York. New York was claimed by an Englishman named Hudson, but who was employed by the Dutch government in The Hague back in Amsterdam. And so he claimed it for the Netherlands. So it was called New Netherlands. They came in. They had a very infamous case where they bought the island of Manhattan from the wrong tribe for a ridiculously low price. A later historian likened it in the early 1900s to $24. And that's become kind of a symbolic thing. You look later on at the civil rights movement, and the island of Alcatraz was taken over in quotes, by a lot of adolescent and young adult Native Americans. And on their little manifesto, they stated that if San Francisco and the federal government wanted Alcatraz Island back, they needed to pay them $24 for getting it back. And they were making an allusion to that, to the island of Manhattan being bought for $24 from the wrong tribe. So the Dutch were known as being very business savvy. There was another anecdote that goes back to this time period. You could find it in primary source stuff.
What do you mean wrong tribe?
The tribe that didn't even claim that land, that island. We're not inhabiting it. We're not, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So someone did it on their behalf, another tribe. So at any rate, at least they were not recognized as the rightful, right? I hate to say owners because they saw it differently, but owners of that island, recognized by the other tribes as such. And so at any rate, there was another one where a Dutchman supposedly told the Native American, I want to buy from you for this price the amount of land that I could cover with my blanket. And the Native American was like, are you crazy? I'm looking at your blanket. Sure. Well, he dethreads that darn thing so that blanket ends up covering about an acre. and I kid you not. And the Native American, through the interpreter, spoke to the interpreter and said, that man's the white devil. And the name is kind of stuck, right, as a negative stereotype of the pale face of the white man in Native American folklore. But the Dutch, right, they were known as being very savvy, business savvy. You could look, for instance, in Indonesia, islands like Java and Mocha and other islands, right, where they came and took over in the early modern era militarily, took over these islands from the Portuguese and other groups and cultivated coffee and other big money makers and then sold them for profit. And so they also became the secret hated middleman by providing loans and providing sugar machinery when it came to the Atlantic slave trade. They provided a lot of loans for people to buy slaves and equipment for people in the Americas and the Caribbean and Brazil, etc., to buy equipment to refine the sugar that the slaves were cultivating. So they were heavily involved in that as well. And they were fighting their own independence against Spain. And so in fighting Spain, right, they declared that they were not going to be like Spain because the Spanish instituted the Spanish Inquisition against the Netherlands. And they had people burned at the stake publicly. So at any rate, they issued a statement of religious toleration in the Netherlands. The Hague did. All right. So in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands itself, you could find groups of Jewish communities building their own synagogues, of Muslims building their own mosques, and a myriad of Christian denominations building their own churches in Amsterdam, in Leiden, and these other towns. So it stands to reason that they would allow diversity and tolerance in New York when they took it over, right? And they did. There was the largest group of Sephardic Jews from northern Brazil and the New World and the Old World of Europe in New Amsterdam, in New York City. The first synagogues were built there. Yeah.
Hey, when did it change? What was the other thing you were calling it before it became New York?
So New York was New Netherlands, and New York City was New Amsterdam.
Oh, and then when did it change?
1664. The English came in with their navy and took it over. So it was just a brief window. From the early 1600s to 1664, it was claimed by the Dutch. And then that year it was renamed New York after the Duke of York and became an English colony. They established also Wall Street. It literally was a street with a wall, a military wall. And they established the beginnings, the primal origins of the Wall Street Stock Exchange. The Dutch did. So in many ways, they were ahead of their period. They were ahead of their time. Very progressive, the Dutch. All right. But you look at certain instances. You could look up a guy, right, known as Anthony the Turk Van Salee, V-A-N and then S-A-L-E-E. This guy was North African and very dark skinned. He inhabited the same home as a white woman. He was found for public inebriation, physical assault and battery, fixing his prices with the fur trade, or doing something with the prices that was seen to be illegal. And he found himself, punished a few times, but rather leniently. You could find the Quakers, where the governor of New Netherlands, of New York, threatened to have them expelled for trying to convert other people. All right. And you find the Jews, who at certain different times there were bread riots because they said the Jews were hoarding the bread at a time when it was scarce, right? Of course, the same old stereotypes about the Jews being money lovers, parasites, etc., right? Everything blamed on them back in Europe. So at any rate, in those three instances, we have primary source evidence that the Dutch West India Company, the initials are VOC. Don't ask me to say that, what those words stand for in the Dutch language. I don't remember, and they're long words. But the VOC, or the Dutch West India Company, were chartered by The Hague back in the Netherlands to have claim over this colony. There's evidence of them writing to their governor and perpetrating the same stereotypes about those three demographics, saying, we know the Jews are money lovers and they're parasites, etc. But we know Anthony Van Sally is a lascivious black man. We know the Quakers are a dangerous sect, but they're helping the colony make money, so let them be. All right, and I'm going off of just a couple popular books where you could find these quotes. Okay. One is that the island at the center of the world. Another one is by a guy named Russell Shorto, Sohorto. But at any rate, right, I make the contention, and perhaps we're not giving the Dutch their credit where credit is due, but just to be thought provocative and see what you think, I make the argument in the last one that the Dutch don't deserve credit for being this cosmopolitan, tolerant society over New York, but they were merely tolerant because of money, because they wanted to make money and they knew that it was economically profitable to, quote, tolerate these other groups. So some people might make the argument, right? Well, what do motives mean when you go outside the realm of individuals and go to a society? If a society offers refuge to Jewish people, to Black African people, to Quakers and all these different denominations, right? And allows them to achieve the American dream, then that's all that matters. But to others, they would say, no, motives matter, even when writ large at the societal level, that when you do things for the wrong reasons, right, you're still going to have that ugly racism bubble up even centuries later. And ironically, a very polyglot, diverse area like New York. And of course, right, you look later, I remember like in the 1990s, there was a lot written in sociology about discrimination in New York City against, and like in Harlem, except against the Puerto Ricans. And how racism still rears its ugly head in New York, despite all that diversity for so many years. All right, so are there any questions or comments? Any questions or comments?
What's your office hours on these?
My office hours? I mean, just right now, are you still feeling kind of overwhelmed?
I would say you're pretty calming overall. But you possess so much information and then you broke it into one paragraph. So trying to like process the information given and then trying to put it into a short paragraph
Yeah.
is kind of a challenge. But yeah, I appreciate like your knowledge is crazy.
Oh, I don't know about that, but I'll tell you what, Melissa, also, if you want, what I could do is I offer this to anyone else too, okay? Is when we get off here in just a moment, I want to make sure everyone has his or her 10 points. And then everyone, I bid you adieu. And then if you wanted to stay on at the end, Melissa, I could talk with you over any of these. And that's for anybody. You have extra questions or want a little extra time, I'd be happy to do that. And then when I post it, I would just cut the end off for your privacy off that posted video. But you're welcome to do that, all of you for that matter. If you want to hang in there at the end here when everyone else gets off. But yeah, to be honest, Melissa, that's all I could think of as far as accommodating that. I'm happy to do that though, as long as you like. All right. But it's hard with COVID. You know what I mean? It is. It's difficult online. It's definitely not a positive facet to online education. And it's definitely a part that I miss about being in person. All right, so let me get your names, make sure that I have the same names. Melissa, if you don't mind telling me, hon, could you tell me your last name?
Hunt.
Hunt, that's easy, good. All right, good, I have all your names, okay? You'll get, like I said, you'll get 10 points for putting up with me for 2 hours. Good for you. That's a long time. That's well-earned 10 points. All right. So if you don't have any other further questions, okay, I'll go ahead and bid you adieu. You guys take care. I hope this was helpful for you. And have a good rest of the week, okay?
Thank you. Appreciate it.
No problem.
Thank you so much for your time,
I have a
Professor.
question. So
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, is there gonna be another one on Thursday, or are you gonna like announce it, or is it just gonna be like
I was gonna announce it, to be honest. Yeah, but I was gonna announce it, Destiny. I want to see how far along we are. Yeah, you know something? You guys are gonna have test 2 Monday. So I definitely want to do that. So yes, we're going to have one on Thursday.
okay.
All right. Yeah, for sure. I want to make sure that you guys are prepared for or not test 2, test 1. Right? You guys have test 1 pretty soon.
You scared me for a second.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, test 1,
That's okay.
not test 2. Sorry about that. So yes, we will, and I'll give the announcement. We will meet again on Thursday. All right, so thank you. You guys have a great couple days. I appreciate you hanging in there throughout the 2 hours.
Thank you, Professor.
You're very welcome.